So, all right, so in the first ecosystems ecosystems biodiversity, the first two objectives are looking at succession and then looking at when you essentially disrupt a population and how all these different things can lead to issues in an ecosystem. Okay, and so let's go ahead and look at the first one. Okay, Tanner and Brady are here. Put those in. Okay. Anyway, so we'll look at that first group of stuff all about succession. Okay. We're going to use the whiteboard here. So, succession is essentially how an ecosystem responds to a disruption. Okay, so disruptions, these can be things like fires or landslides, floods, all those sorts of things, okay? Anything where you are getting, another really big important one is going to be lava flows, okay? Anything where we are completely going to change up our, what is going on in these ecosystems, okay? And so with succession, there are two types of succession. We're going to have primary and secondary. So let's look at primary succession. Okay, primary succession is where all soil has been removed and only barren rock is left available. Okay, so this is an issue. When you only have barren rock, nothing can really grow on that. You need to get soil. And so the one way that we get soil is we have this species that'll move in. We have things called pioneer species. So pioneer species move in and will be the first species to colonize an area after a disruption. Okay? In these kind of situations where you have only barren rock available, the most common type of species that will move in are called lichen, okay? So lichen move in and attach to rocks. Does everybody know what lichen is? This is like if you were on a hike and you look on a rock and it's got that green and orange kind of almost like a fungusy looking stuff on it. That is lichen. Okay, and so what lichen do is these break down rock into smaller particles and also add organic material to the broken down rock as the lichen die. Okay, so lichen are just kind of breaking down this rock. Then as the lichen die, their organic material gets mixed in. So once you have broken down rock and organic material, what starts to form? Anybody tell me?
Soil.
Soil forms, okay? So with broken down rock and organic material, soil forms. Okay, so once we have soil formed, then we essentially go into secondary succession, okay? The big difference between primary and secondary succession is that primary needs to make its soil before everything starts. Secondary already has soil available. So like a fire can burn down everything in a forest, but there's still going to be soil available, okay? Secondary succession, soil is available to start, okay? You can also think of this as the second phase of primary succession, all right? Once we have our soil, we're going to start growing some things in it. And I'm going to use fire as a big example here because fire is one of the easier ones to think about. We have fires in Montana. It's easier to comprehend. So once fire has burned down forest, okay, that is going to leave soil with all of this organic burnt nutrients, okay? That burning of the trees and the shrubs and all of these different things is going to lead you to have more nutrients in your soil. Your soils will be very rich. A couple days after a fire, does anybody know what generally tends to move in? What sort of stuff starts to grow a couple days after fire? I will go ahead and tell you then, I guess. Once that this is burned and you have all this stuff called fireweed begins to grow, okay? It is an early succession species. This is called an early succession species, okay? It is coming in and it's one of the first things. Now these need light and they don't do well with sharing, so once other things start to move in, you're going to lose your fireweed. But fireweed is the first thing that will start to grow. Once the fireweed starts to die down, you will get different grasses are the next step, okay? After you get grasses, then you're going to start moving into shrubs. Grasses, then shrubs. Okay, once we have our shrubs, then we're going to start growing our next sort of thing, and there's really only two things that are left. Sometimes this is your finishing thing, and sometimes it's not. We're going to grow our shade intolerant trees, okay? These are going to be things like pine trees, okay? So like a lodgepole pine is shade intolerant, okay? This means they need a lot of sun to grow, okay? But lodgepole pines come up relatively quickly. And a lot of forests around us, they're mainly dominated by lodgepole pines. You can have lodgepole pine forests, that is fine. Sometimes that's as far as you make it. Lodgepole pine is also serotinous, which means that it is fire released. The cones on a lodgepole pine, which holds the seeds, don't even open up until they get fire released. Basically, the fire has to come through, burn, and that will release a lot of different stuff, okay? And so you've got your lodgepole pine or these shade intolerant trees, and they need to grow. Sometimes this is where you end of succession. If not, you're going to have a lot of your more hardwood trees that can grow in, okay? So your shade tolerant trees will grow over them. Okay, whatever is your final species, okay, so whether it's a Douglas fir forest or a Engelmann spruce forest, or let's go ahead and say it's cottonwoods, all of these different things, whatever your final species is called your climax species, okay? And this species will dominate the area until you have another disruption. Okay, so like lodgepole pine forests, every about 50 to 100 years has a fire that will clear them out. It causes a new succession to roll through there, okay? It's on a pretty regular basis. I guess I'd say probably more like 40 to 100 years. but they clear out the old trees so that new trees can grow, okay? Also, again, like I said, they need fire in order to release their seeds, all right? And this is essentially succession, okay? You have either primary or secondary, and it's just after something has happened to an ecosystem, what does that ecosystem do to repair itself or to come back, okay? Does anybody have any questions about succession? I will take your silence as a no. Okay. Let's go ahead and I'm going to clear this. Is everybody good if I clear this? Sounds like a yes to me.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. And we'll talk about the next stuff, which is ecological and biological disruptions. Okay. So when you have like a problem in a trophic level. Come on. There we go. All right. So let's talk about trophic disruptions. Okay, so this is essentially a disruption to a food chain. So when something new gets added, all right, or taken away. So there's two examples I'm going to use here. One, let's talk about invasive species. Invasive species. Okay, so invasive species, these are organisms that come from a different area and have no natural predators. Okay, this leads to them out competing native species. Okay, so we have organisms that come from different areas, they have no natural predators, and they will outcompete those species. Okay, can anybody think of an invasive species off the top of your head?
Python.
Python. What did you say, Sheila? I heard
Thistles.
python. Sorry, say that one more time.
Thistles.
Thistles. Okay. So yeah, there are some plants. There's some. Timber's really nailed it on the head there. I'm going to go ahead and go with hers. When you talk about, there are a lot of people who have exotic pets that release them into the wild. Okay, so people who have pythons will just release them after they're like, well, I don't want a python anymore, or this is more work than I thought it was going to be. So they'll release them, and then those pythons will go out and they will take away all of the food that other snakes would eat, that other things that prey on rodents and all those. They just completely disrupt the food chain there. You can also, I'm going to use one that I know a little bit more about, maybe not thistles. There's this thing called Russian olive. Okay, you also have plants. Okay, so Russian olives. Russian olive trees are a plant, it comes from Russia, that grow pretty much anywhere. Okay, they don't need a lot of water, they grow pretty thick, and what people brought them over originally for, they make great shelter belts. Okay, so people who are on really flat plains that want to have some places to either have their cows get out of the wind or to surround their house so their house isn't just getting pummeled with wind, they would put in these kind of shelter belts made with Russian olive. Okay, now the thing about Russian olives that we didn't know is Russian olive puts out into the ground a natural chemical that doesn't allow other plant species to grow well around it. Okay, and also the leaf litter, so the leaves that these Russian olives make, they'll get dispersed, whether it's in the streams or on the ground around it or potentially further away from it. The leaves also contain these chemicals, and as those leaves decompose either into the soil or into the streams, it will cause big problems for the organisms that live there and essentially make it so that only Russian olives can survive. So Russian olives, they grow fast, they grow strong, they grow anywhere, good for a lot of things. They make a great shelter belt out in the middle of eastern Montana. However, these Russian olives are beginning to grow and take up much of the riverbanks of Montana's river systems. Okay, so Montana's river systems are, the banks of those are getting taken up by Russian olives, things where organisms used to be able to go up and out, and they used to have different sorts of trees and all that sorts of, that's no longer there. This is a big problem. FWP, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, has identified Russian olive as a problem species, and I know that was something I worked on in college in a class during an ecology class. We did a project where we were looking at Russian olive and how much of the chemical that they were producing was in waterways. So it is an issue. Okay, this is one kind of trophic disruption, is when you have a species that comes in and just completely changes all of the organisms inside of that species. The other one that I want to talk about is the removal of native species. Does anybody know what happened in the early 90s in Yellowstone National Park? What did they bring back?
Wolves.
Yes, okay. So we're going to talk about Yellowstone wolf reintroduction. And this is really interesting to me because this is what we're going to talk about, is wolves are a keystone species, okay? Essentially, this means if they are removed, ecosystem falls apart, okay? So in the 1930s, they removed wolves because people just generally don't like wolves, okay? Anybody know what happened? So wolves were removed in 1930, whatever, somewhere around there, okay? What happened after 1930, after the wolves were removed?
Elk.
Elk exploded. Elk populations exploded, okay? So elk populations explode, and there is no way to keep them in check. Okay? And so one thing that elk really, really like to eat is aspen saplings, aspen tree saplings. So elk begin to eat all of the aspen tree saplings, okay? So there is essentially all these little aspen trees. Once the bigger trees go away, there is fewer and fewer aspen trees, okay? Well, does anybody know what uses aspen trees in Yellowstone National Park? Like a lot?
Woodpeckers.
Woodpeckers probably do. Think about even a bigger animal. It's a mammal, but it lives in the water.
Beaver.
Beavers, okay? So beavers use aspen trees to make dams, okay? When we have less aspen trees, beaver populations decline because there are less aspens. Okay? There's also fewer dams. What do dams do?
Filter out water.
They do filter out water. What else do they do to water?
Slow the water flow.
Yes, okay. So the water flow where natural beaver dams used to essentially make ponds and wetlands. Beaver dams are no longer there. Which leads to faster water, less water pooling, and that wetland, okay? So when the water is not pooling up there, that wetland area, the wetland area created by beavers, essentially became grassland with a stream through it. Okay, so we remove the wolves. This is one of the biggest ecological things that people have seen. Okay, you remove wolves, and it's going to essentially create this whole trophic cascade where everything starts to go. Elk get too big. They eat the aspen saplings. Aspen aren't there. Beaver can't use them to make dams. The beaver population declines. The water flow starts to increase, and then the wetland turns into grassland. So by removing one species, we affect everything in this ecosystem, okay? And so in the 80s, people were like, well, what can we do? What can we do? And what they ended up doing was they airdropped. They literally airdropped a bunch of, well, they airdropped some wolves, and then they just released some packs into the thing. There have also been some places where wolves have been airdropped into Canada to remove moose population. It's pretty crazy, actually. But yeah, wolves are super important. So once wolves were reintroduced, what do you think we saw? What happened to the elk?
There were less of them.
Yep, elk population goes down, okay? But it doesn't go down to a bad level, okay? This is a natural check and balance. It is regulated, okay? So we add the wolves, the elk population goes down, is regulated, there's a normal amount of elk, okay? Because we didn't add like 1 million wolves, we added like 30. So it was about the number of wolves that you would expect there, okay? So the elk population goes down. What happens to the aspen trees?
All of the saplings don't get eaten so they can grow.
Yeah, exactly. So aspen trees grow to maturity. Okay, once the aspen trees grow to maturity, this allows for more beaver usage and beaver population rebounds. Okay, so we're going to get more beavers coming back in, and the more beavers we have come back in, the more dams that'll get produced, which will result in water flow slowing and reintroduction of natural wetlands. Okay, and wetlands, again, we've talked about this before. Wetlands are really important because they filter out water and they provide more habitat than just grasslands do for a lot of different organisms. Okay, does everybody see how these two types of trophic disruptions, whether it's an invasive species adding something new that has no competition or removing something like a keystone species like wolves, can cause these two types of things to happen? Yes, Mr. Schultz, I do see that. Thanks, guys. Great job. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this, and I am going